"Oh my God, what just happened? How could anyone do something like this?" The words echoed in Officer James' mind as he stood in the middle of the forest, staring at the dog tied to the tree. It was a sight he would never forget. It was supposed to be a simple call, just another day on patrol. A report had come in from an anonymous source about a dog in distress, tied up and abandoned in the woods. Officer James and his team were used to dealing with all kinds of calls, but nothing could have prepared them for this. As they pushed through the thick underbrush, the air was damp, the quiet almost unnerving. The distant calls of birds and the rustle of the wind were the only sounds they could hear. Every step they took felt heavier as they got closer to the location. Then, suddenly, they saw it. A German shepherd, once strong and proud, was now reduced to a trembling, skeletal figure. It lay on the cold forest floor, its body tied with what looked like an old, frayed rope. The dog's fur was matted and dirt-covered, its ribs showing through its thin coat. Its eyes were wide, terrified, and yet they seemed to plead for something, anything, to change. Officer James' heart sank. This wasn't just an abandoned dog. This was an animal that had suffered. For how long? He couldn't say. But it was clear that whoever had done this had no idea how to break the bond between a dog and its heart. "Is it alive?" one of the officers asked, voice trembling with both disbelief and anger. The dog was so still, its breathing shallow. But the officer's words were barely out of his mouth before the dog lifted its head slightly. For a split second, James could have sworn that the dog's eyes met his, almost as if it were saying, "Help me." His stomach churned. There was no time to waste. As quickly as possible, they moved closer, but with caution. The last thing they wanted was to spook the animal even more. The dog had been through too much. It needed gentle hands, not force. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. We're here to help," James murmured softly, stepping toward the dog. His voice was calm but filled with concern. The dog's tail barely twitched as if trying to decide whether to trust these strangers. The officers worked quickly but carefully, one of them offering water, another trying to gently untie the rope. As they pulled the frayed ends of the rope loose, the dog whimpered, a sound so soft it barely registered in the silence of the woods. Yet, there was something more in that sound, something that made James' heart tighten. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep, raw sense of betrayal. The moment the dog was free from the rope, it didn't run. Instead, it stayed there, looking up at the officers with those sad, trusting eyes. Its body was weak, but it was alive. It was breathing. That was the first step. James carefully reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. The dog didn't flinch. For a moment, there was just the quiet rustling of trees above and the sound of shallow breaths between them. But in that moment, something changed. The dog's eyes softened, just a little. The slightest wag of its tail, a signal of hope, even if it was barely perceptible. James' eyes filled with determination. This wasn't just about rescuing a dog. This was about giving it the chance it had been denied. Whoever had abandoned this dog didn't deserve to be remembered. But he, Officer James, would remember this moment for as long as he lived. He wouldn't let this dog fall through the cracks. Not this time. The officers gently helped the dog to its feet, guiding it through the forest, one careful step after another. And as they made their way out of the woods, there was no turning back. They had to find out what had happened to this poor animal. They had to know the story it had been trying to tell them. What would they discover next? As they made their way out of the forest, the air seemed to grow heavier. Officer James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dog, though free from the rope, wasn't in the clear. It limped along, its body too weak to keep up with the officers, its tail dragging on the ground instead of wagging like it should. But what worried James more was the emptiness in its eyes. It had survived the forest, but at what cost? At the shelter, the officers carefully laid the dog down on a soft blanket. It let out a quiet whimper, too tired to protest, its body still trembling. The vet arrived shortly after, and her first glance at the dog told her everything. "It's malnourished, severely dehydrated, and there's more," she said, her voice low. "This dog's been through a lot more than just being abandoned." James' stomach twisted as the vet began her examination. The German shepherd's body was full of old scars, deep, fading marks that told the story of a past filled with pain. And yet, despite it all, the dog had survived. It hadn't given up. The vet confirmed what they feared: the dog's physical condition could heal. But the emotional damage? That would take much longer. As the vet worked, one of the officers, Sarah, noticed something strange. Beneath the dog's collar, hidden under the thick fur, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was old and worn, as if it had been kept close to the dog for a long time. Sarah unfolded it gently, revealing a photo. It was a picture of the dog, sitting proudly beside a family. A man, a woman, and two young children stood next to the dog, all smiling. It was clear this dog had once been loved. But now, it seemed like the family had disappeared, leaving the dog to suffer alone. Officer James took the photo, his heart sinking as he studied the faces. The family looked happy, whole. What had happened? Why had they abandoned the dog like this? Was there something more to this story than just neglect? Who would do this? James muttered to himself, holding the photo up. The family looked so caring, so kind. How could they just leave their dog in the woods? The question gnawed at him. But the dog's past wasn't just about physical pain, it was about betrayal. Somewhere along the way, the bond between the dog and its owner had been broken. The photo seemed like a reminder of everything the dog had once known, of a life filled with warmth and companionship, now reduced to nothing more than a faded memory. As the hours passed, the dog began to settle. Its breathing steadied, and it finally closed its eyes, though there was still an unease in its posture. It was clear that trust would not come easily for this animal. The trauma went beyond the physical wounds. It was written in the way the dog avoided eye contact, in how it recoiled at sudden movements. But one thing was certain, the rescue wasn't over. The dog had been saved, yes, but there were still so many unanswered questions. James knew that finding the family in the photo was now just as important as caring for the dog. The search for answers had begun. The following day, Officer James couldn't stop thinking about the photo. The image of the dog with the family weighed heavily on his mind. He kept returning to one thought: what had happened to them? He couldn't understand how a family who had once loved this dog could just leave it behind in the woods. It didn't make sense. James knew he couldn't just leave things where they were. He had to find the answers. He returned to the shelter early the next morning, hoping the dog might show some improvement. As he walked through the door, the sight of the German Shepherd lying quietly in its bed made his heart ache. It was still so fragile, its body thin, and its eyes heavy with sadness. Yet, there was something else. It was more alert now. It was trying, slowly, cautiously, to trust again. As James sat down beside the dog, it looked up at him. Its gaze was hesitant, but there was no fear in it anymore. The dog still didn't trust easily, but at least now, it was starting to acknowledge that not all humans meant harm. James reached out his hand, and the dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, it licked his fingers gently, a tiny sign that the walls were starting to come down. He smiled softly, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to figure out the connection between the family and the dog. The photo was his only lead, and he was determined not to let it slip away without answers. He decided to start with the shelter staff. They had been in the area for years, and they might know something about the family or the dog's history. "I'll ask around," James told the shelter manager, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "Maybe someone here recognizes the family in the photo." The manager, a woman named Clara, agreed to help. She pulled out the shelter's records and began looking through them. It didn't take long for her to find something that made James' heart race. There, in the old adoption files, was a name: David Lawson. David Lawson, Clara repeated, scanning the document. He was the owner of this dog, back when the dog was first brought to us as a puppy. He was a good man, or at least, he used to be. He and his family adopted the dog right here, a little over 5 years ago. They were so happy. I remember the kids, they loved that dog like nothing else. Clara paused, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavier. She seemed to be thinking back, her brow furrowed. Then, about 2 years ago, she continued, David came in by himself, looking upset. He said he was having some personal problems, but I didn't press him. Shortly after that, the family disappeared. No one saw them again. David came in a few more times, and then he just stopped coming. We never heard from them again. James felt his heart drop. There it was. The family had vanished without a trace. David Lawson and his family had abandoned the dog, but it didn't seem like it was by choice. Something had happened to them. James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness for what might have transpired. Whatever was behind their sudden disappearance, it had led to this. But the question still lingered. Where had they gone? "We need to find David," James said, determination rising in his chest. "If he's still out there, maybe he knows what happened to the rest of the family. And maybe, just maybe, we can help this dog find closure." Clara nodded, but there was a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "I'll help however I can, Officer James. But you might want to prepare yourself for what you might find. This doesn't sound like a simple case." James looked back at the dog, now resting calmly in its bed, looking at him with those sad, trusting eyes. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. He knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but he couldn't turn back now. The dog had already been through too much. And now, so had he. The search for David Lawson had begun. The days that followed were filled with phone calls, visits, and long hours of digging through records. Officer James couldn't focus on anything else. He became obsessed with finding David Lawson. There was a sense of urgency in every call he made, every door he knocked on. The more he dug, the more he began to uncover, but the truth was still elusive. It was Clara who finally provided the breakthrough. After a few more days of searching, she managed to track down an address for David Lawson. It was an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town, one that had seen better days. The building was run down, with cracked windows and peeling paint. James stood in front of it, staring up at the entrance, trying to gather his thoughts. This was it. This was the lead he had been waiting for. "Are you sure this is the right place?" his partner, Officer Sarah, asked as she pulled up next to him. Her voice was tense, a mix of concern and caution. "I'm sure," James replied. "This is the address. Let's see if we can get some answers." Together, they made their way inside, the worn wooden floors creaking under their feet. The smell of stale air and old furniture filled the hallway as they approached the apartment. The door was slightly ajar, and they could hear the faint sound of music playing softly from within. James knocked gently, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his clothes were wrinkled as though he hadn't bothered to change in a while. James recognized him immediately. It was David Lawson. "David Lawson?" James asked, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." David's face went pale as soon as he saw the officers standing at his door. For a moment, he seemed frozen, as if he hadn't expected anyone to come looking for him. But then, without a word, he stepped aside, allowing them in. The apartment was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, empty takeout containers piling up in the corner. It was clear that David had been struggling. As James stepped further into the room, he couldn't help but notice the pictures on the walls, some of them old and faded. There, in the corner of the room, was a framed photo of the family from the image in the shelter's file. It was the same photo, the one with David, his wife, and the children with their beloved German Shepherd. James' heart sank. It was clear that the family had once been whole, happy. But now, the emptiness in the room reflected something darker. David had been living in this chaotic state for who knows how long, consumed by whatever had torn his family apart. I didn't want to hurt her," David muttered, his voice cracking. "I never wanted to leave her out there. But I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't keep her anymore." James' eyes narrowed, confused. "What do you mean? What happened?" David sank into a chair, his hands trembling. He looked down at the floor, avoiding their gaze. "I didn't abandon her on purpose. Things just went wrong. The family, we were falling apart. My wife, she couldn't handle everything anymore. And when we lost the house, she just disappeared with the kids. She left me. I don't even know where they are. One day, I had nowhere to go. I didn't know what to do. So, I took her to the woods, thinking I could come back for her, but I never could. I couldn't face it. I couldn't face her." David's voice broke as he finished speaking, his hands shaking with guilt. He buried his face in his palms, clearly consumed by regret. "I never meant to hurt her. I never wanted her to be alone. I just didn't know how to fix everything." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. James stood still, processing the information. The story was tragic. David's life had crumbled, and in his desperation, he had made a choice that would haunt him forever. David had thought leaving the dog in the forest would solve everything, that somehow, things would get better. But it had only made everything worse. The German Shepherd, abandoned and alone, had spent days or weeks in the woods, lost and terrified, because David had been unable to face the truth of his broken family. James felt a deep sense of sympathy for David, but at the same time, his heart ached for the dog who had been caught in the middle of a family's destruction. "Do you have any idea where your family went?" Sarah asked softly, her voice tinged with compassion. David shook his head. "No. I tried to find them. But it's like they vanished. I don't know if they're alive or dead, if they're somewhere safe, or if they've completely disappeared. All I know is that I lost everything, including her." It was then that James realized the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded. David wasn't just a man who had abandoned his dog. He was a man who had lost everything, the love of his life, his children, his home, and in his desperation, he had made a terrible choice. But now, the dog was safe. And James knew that while the answers might not bring the family back, they could help bring peace to the one living being who had been left behind. James looked at David, his face hardening with resolve. "You need to make things right. For her. She deserves better than what you've done." David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I know. I'll do anything. I'll make it right." James and Sarah left the apartment, their minds heavy with the weight of the story they had uncovered. The search for David had led them to a heartbreaking conclusion, but there was still one thing left to do: give the dog a second chance at life, a life free from pain and betrayal. The journey was far from over, but it was clear now more than ever that the dog's path to healing was just beginning. As James and Sarah walked back to their car, the weight of what they had just uncovered seemed to press down on them. David Lawson's life had spiraled out of control, and in the midst of his pain, he had made the tragic decision to abandon his dog, the one living thing that had always been there for him. But now, the pieces of the story were coming together, and it wasn't just about finding David anymore, it was about giving the German Shepherd a chance to heal. The dog had been through so much, and it wasn't just physical wounds that needed mending. The emotional scars ran deep. James thought back to when they first found her in the woods, how she had looked up at him with those sad, pleading eyes that had seen too much for one lifetime. She was more than just an abandoned dog. She was a survivor, and somehow, she still had the strength to trust again. Back at the shelter, the dog had been receiving the care she so desperately needed. She was slowly starting to regain her strength, but James could see that there was still a long road ahead. She was still cautious around new people, still wary of sudden movements, and her past had clearly left her with deep emotional wounds. But she wasn't the same as when they found her. The spark of hope was starting to shine through. James sat down beside her that evening, as he had done many times before. Her name was still unknown to him, but he couldn't help but feel a deep connection to her. He placed his hand on her head gently, just as he had when he first found her. Her eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't look afraid. She didn't look like a dog abandoned in the woods, she looked like a dog who was slowly starting to believe that there were people who would care for her, people who wouldn't leave her behind. "You're going to be okay," James whispered softly, his voice low and comforting. He didn't know if she understood, but somehow, he felt like she did. "We're going to get through this together." The next morning, James made a decision. It was time for the dog to have a new life, one full of love and safety. David had admitted his mistakes, but he couldn't undo the damage he had caused. His dog deserved better. It was clear that the bond between them had been broken, perhaps irreparably. And now, the dog needed someone who would give her the love and care she had been denied for so long. James didn't want to give up on the dog, but he knew that she needed a fresh start, a new family. And there was only one person he could think of who could give her that, his own partner, Sarah. She had grown attached to the dog during their time at the shelter, and it was clear from the way Sarah looked at her that she had already become part of her heart. After a long talk, Sarah agreed to take the dog in. "I've been thinking about this too," she said, her voice quiet. "She needs someone who will give her a home, a real home. And I think I can be that for her." James smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The dog wasn't just going to be rescued from the woods anymore, she was going to be loved, cared for, and given the life she deserved. The scars of her past would not define her future. A few days later, James stood beside Sarah as she gently led the German Shepherd into her new home. The dog hesitated for a moment, sniffing the air, taking in her new surroundings. Then, as if sensing the love and warmth in the room, she took a tentative step forward. "This is your new beginning," Sarah whispered, her hand gently rubbing the dog's back. The dog looked up at her, her eyes softening, no longer filled with fear, but with curiosity and hope. She was no longer the lost, abandoned animal in the woods. She was a dog who had been given a second chance. As Sarah knelt down beside her, the dog let out a soft, contented sigh. She laid down on the rug, curling up in a peaceful ball. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. And as the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room, it seemed as though everything had come full circle. James stood at the doorway, watching Sarah and the dog. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that, even though the journey had been difficult, the dog had found a place where she could finally heal. And as he left them alone, he couldn't help but smile. The past was painful, but the future was filled with promise. The German Shepherd had been through so much, but she was finally home. The chapter of her life in the woods was over. The next chapter was one of love, healing, and a fresh start. And this time, she would never be abandoned again. Weeks passed, and the dog, now named Hope, settled into her new life with Sarah. She had come a long way from the terrified, malnourished dog that James and Sarah had first found in the woods. The change was evident in the way she walked, the way she looked at people, and even in the way she wagged her tail when Sarah returned home from work. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was progress. Hope still had moments of hesitation, moments when she would shrink back from loud noises or unfamiliar faces. But Sarah was patient, always gentle, always understanding. And Hope responded to that patience in ways that words could never fully explain. Little by little, the dog was learning to trust again. But even as Hope blossomed, the question of David lingered in the back of Sarah's mind. She had seen the pain in his eyes when he spoke about what had happened, but she also knew that the pain he caused was not something easily forgotten. Hope's journey was one of healing, but David's had yet to be written. One afternoon, while Hope was resting on the porch, Sarah decided to visit David. She had hesitated before, she wasn't sure what she could do or what he needed, but she felt it was time to understand more. She owed it to Hope, and maybe to David himself, to find out if there was any way he could make peace with the past. David's apartment was still in disarray, though it seemed like he had made some small efforts to clean up. He was sitting by the window when Sarah knocked on his door. He looked surprised to see her but didn't seem shocked. It was as though, deep down, he had expected someone would come looking for him sooner or later. "I didn't think I'd see you again," David said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't think anyone would care." Sarah could see the toll that time had taken on him. He was still haunted by the decisions he had made, but she could see the glimmer of regret in his eyes. It wasn't enough to undo what he had done, but it was a start. "I just wanted to check in," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm, patient. "I know what happened. I know you didn't mean to hurt Hope. But I need you to know that she's safe now. She's home with me." David's eyes filled with tears as he ran a hand through his hair. "I couldn't fix what I broke. I couldn't fix my family, and I couldn't fix what I did to her. I didn't deserve her, not after everything I put her through." Sarah hesitated before speaking. "But you can still make things right. It's not too late. You can't change the past, but you can try to heal. For yourself, and for Hope." David shook his head. "I don't even know where my family is. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't know what happened to them." He paused, his voice faltering. "But what I do know is that I can't keep living like this. I need to make it right with her, even if she's not mine anymore." For a long moment, the two of them stood in silence. Sarah knew that David wasn't ready to take full responsibility yet, but there was something about his words that made her believe he wanted to try. "Maybe it's not about fixing everything," Sarah said softly. "Maybe it's just about making sure she's happy now. That's all that matters. Hope has a second chance, and so do you. It's not too late for either of you." David looked at her, his face still shadowed by pain, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I don't know where to start. But I want to start somewhere." Sarah nodded. "You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to take the first step." That was all she could offer him for now. She couldn't change what had happened, but perhaps she could give him the chance to find redemption, just as Hope had been given the chance to heal. With time, maybe both of them could find peace. As Sarah left David's apartment, her mind was filled with a sense of cautious optimism. There was still so much unknown, so much pain that had yet to be healed, but the journey was far from over. Hope had been through so much, but now she had a new life, a life filled with love and trust. And maybe, just maybe, David could find the path toward his own redemption, too. Back home, Hope was waiting for Sarah on the porch, her tail wagging when she saw her approach. Sarah smiled as she crouched down to pet her. The bond between them had deepened over time. Hope had become more than just a dog, she was family. And together, they had both begun the long process of healing. For Hope, the future was bright. And for David, the road to redemption had only just begun. But one thing was certain, both of their stories were far from over. In the following weeks, Sarah continued to see David, though their meetings were brief and far from easy. Each conversation was filled with an unspoken understanding that they were both navigating the delicate path of healing, David, from his past mistakes, and Sarah, from the wounds left by the life that Hope had lived before. It wasn't a journey they could take alone, and it seemed, at least for now, that they needed each other. David began volunteering at the shelter where Hope had been taken after her rescue, trying to give back in any way he could. At first, it was just small tasks, washing the kennels, walking the dogs, helping with the paperwork. But as the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to notice something different in him. The guilt in his eyes had started to soften, replaced by a quiet determination. It was clear he was committed to turning his life around. Hope, too, had started to blossom in ways that Sarah could never have imagined. Though she still had her moments of fear, especially in unfamiliar situations, there were flashes of the playful dog she was meant to be. She had begun to trust again, not just with Sarah but with others in her life. Each time they went for a walk, Hope would prance happily beside Sarah, her tail wagging with excitement. She had learned that not all humans were to be feared. Not all of them would abandon her. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting on her porch, watching Hope play in the yard, when she got a call from the shelter. It was the head of the shelter, Barbara, with a question that made Sarah pause. "Sarah," Barbara said, her voice calm but filled with uncertainty, "there's something you need to know." Sarah immediately stood up, the concern flooding her mind. "What is it?" "There's been a family who came in looking for a dog. They saw Hope's picture and, well, they recognize her. They claim she's their dog." Sarah's heart sank, and she quickly sat down on the porch steps. "What do you mean? Are they sure?" "They're sure," Barbara replied gently. "They say she's theirs. And they've been looking for her ever since she disappeared." The words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Hope's past, the part of her life that Sarah had so carefully shielded her from, was now coming back to haunt them both. But how could this be? Hadn't Hope already been abandoned once? Hadn't she suffered enough? Sarah quickly agreed to meet the family. She needed to know who these people were, what they wanted, and whether Hope's past would affect her future. The family turned out to be a middle-aged couple, visibly distraught. They seemed genuine, even as their faces were filled with worry. They had brought photos of a younger Hope, a happy, healthy dog with a shiny coat and bright eyes, a stark contrast to the scared animal Sarah had found in the woods. As Sarah sat across from them in the shelter office, the couple explained what had happened. They had adopted Hope when she was just a puppy, but one day, without warning, she disappeared. They had spent years searching, putting up flyers, checking shelters, but there had been no sign of her. After all this time, they thought they had lost her forever. "Are you sure she's our dog?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. Sarah was silent for a long moment, staring at the couple. There was a part of her that wanted to believe them, but another part of her that couldn't shake the image of Hope cowering in the woods, waiting for someone to find her, someone to care for her again. Could it really be the same dog? Was this a case of mistaken identity? "I don't know," Sarah replied softly, the uncertainty clear in her voice. "Hope has been through a lot. She's had a rough life, and I've been the one to care for her for the past few months. She's come so far. I can't just let her go without knowing what's best for her." The couple's faces fell as Sarah spoke, their hope quickly turning to despair. They had dreamed of being reunited with their dog for years, but hearing Sarah's words made it clear that things were not as simple as they had imagined. Hope had been through too much, and she was no longer the same dog who had lived with them. Sarah made it clear that, before any decisions could be made, Hope needed time to adjust, to show her true feelings. The decision wasn't just about what the family wanted, it was about what was best for Hope. After everything she had been through, Sarah wasn't about to let anyone take her away without making sure it was right. Hope needed time to decide who she wanted to be with, and who she trusted. Her past had shaped her, but her future was still hers to choose. The couple left the shelter that day, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the road ahead wasn't as simple as they had hoped. Sarah, though conflicted, knew she had made the right decision. She wasn't about to make any rash choices about Hope's future. There was still much more to consider. When Sarah returned home, she found Hope waiting for her on the porch, as always. Hope's tail wagged when she saw Sarah, her eyes shining with recognition and trust. Sarah crouched down and hugged the dog tightly, feeling the weight of the past and the hope for the future in her embrace. For now, Sarah knew that she was the one who could offer Hope the love and stability she had always deserved. The question of Hope's past family remained unanswered, but one thing was certain: Hope had a future filled with care, understanding, and a family who would never abandon her again. And that, Sarah thought, was all that mattered. The days following Sarah's decision were filled with uncertainty. While Hope seemed content and secure, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. The visit from Hope's previous family had left a mark on her heart. She knew what was best for Hope, but what about the people who had once loved her? Could she really just shut them out? Hope, for her part, seemed to be adjusting to her new life. Her coat had begun to shine again, and the deep scars of her past were slowly starting to fade. She greeted Sarah every morning with excitement, always by her side, always wanting to be near. And Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the dog who had been through so much and yet had so much love to give. But every time Sarah thought about the family, her heart ached. They had seemed so sincere in their desire to have Hope back. And while she didn't believe it would be right for Hope to return to them, considering all that had happened, Sarah felt she owed it to Hope to find out more. To understand the full story. It was a week later when Sarah called the shelter. She needed to know more about Hope's past and what the family's situation had been. The shelter workers, while hesitant, agreed to give her some information. They explained that Hope had been adopted when the family had been going through a difficult time. They had moved to a new city, and the transition had been overwhelming. Their home life had grown unstable, and it seemed that, in the chaos, Hope had slipped away. After that, they had searched tirelessly, never giving up hope of finding her. Sarah wasn't sure how to feel about what she'd learned. On one hand, it sounded like the family had truly loved Hope. On the other hand, the fact that they hadn't kept a closer eye on her in those early days made Sarah doubt their readiness to take her back. But Sarah was determined to make the right decision for Hope, not just based on guilt or sympathy, but on what would make the dog happiest. The next few days passed in a blur of contemplation. Sarah began noticing small changes in Hope. She seemed more confident, more playful. She would chase after sticks, bounding through the yard with a carefree joy that Sarah hadn't seen in her before. It made Sarah's heart swell with happiness to see Hope like this, finally, truly happy. But then came the phone call that would change everything. It was David. His voice, once filled with regret and despair, now sounded steadier, more resolved. "I've been thinking about it a lot, Sarah. About everything. I can't undo the past, but I've got to do what's right. I've been working on myself, and I'm ready to make a change. I want to be involved in Hope's life. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me, but I'm willing to try." Sarah was silent for a moment. She had suspected this day might come. David was taking responsibility, but was it too late? Was Hope even ready to accept him back into her life after everything? "I think you've made progress, David," Sarah said carefully, "but I need to be honest with you. Hope has come so far. She's not the same dog you abandoned in the woods. She's healed, and I think she deserves to have her future decided on her terms, not on the past." David's voice softened. "I understand. I just need a chance. I need to prove to her that I can be someone she can trust again." Sarah could hear the sincerity in his words, but a part of her couldn't forget what had happened. How could she trust him again, after what he had put Hope through? But at the same time, she realized that this was part of the healing process for everyone involved. Hope's future wasn't just about Sarah anymore, it was about forgiveness, growth, and trust. "I don't know if it's possible, David," Sarah said gently. "But I'll give you the chance to prove it. But it has to be on her terms. It's not about what you want or what I want, it's about what's best for Hope." The decision was made. David would spend time with Hope, but slowly, cautiously. He would have to earn her trust again, and that would take time. But Sarah was willing to give him that chance, because Hope deserved it. A few days later, David met Sarah and Hope at the park. It wasn't a reunion filled with joy and excitement, but there was an air of quiet anticipation. Hope was wary, her eyes flickering between Sarah and David, unsure of what was happening. She had spent so much time learning to trust Sarah, and now she was being asked to trust someone from her past, a person who had hurt her deeply. David approached cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt down in front of Hope, his hand outstretched. Hope sniffed the air, unsure of him at first. She backed away slightly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," David said softly, "but I want to show you that I can be someone you can trust again. I'll wait as long as it takes. I'm sorry for everything." Hope remained still for a moment, her eyes studying him. Slowly, tentatively, she took a small step forward. Then another. And before anyone knew it, Hope was standing in front of David, her nose reaching out to gently sniff his hand. It wasn't a leap of full forgiveness, but it was a step in the right direction. Sarah watched, holding her breath, as David slowly reached out and scratched Hope behind her ears. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and Sarah let out a sigh of relief. This was the beginning of something new, a process of healing, of rebuilding trust, and of moving forward. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But Sarah knew that Hope's journey wasn't just hers alone. It was a journey that involved forgiveness, love, and second chances, for both David and the dog who had been abandoned but had never given up on finding hope. As the days passed, Sarah, David, and Hope began to settle into a new rhythm. It was clear that there were no easy answers. There were moments of progress, but also setbacks, times when Hope would retreat into herself, unsure of her place in this new dynamic. There were moments when David would show up, eager to make things right, only to be met with uncertainty from Hope, who was still unsure whether she could trust him again. David spent his days volunteering at the shelter and attending therapy, trying to rebuild his own life. He was doing everything he could to prove to Sarah, to Hope, and to himself that he had changed. But change took time, and there were still many doubts. Sarah watched it all unfold from the sidelines, her heart torn. She had grown so attached to Hope, who was now a permanent part of her life. The bond between them had grown deeper than she could have imagined. Hope had not only healed physically but had also become a source of strength for Sarah. She had learned to trust again, and in turn, she had given Sarah the ability to heal as well. But Sarah couldn't ignore the fact that David had a right to try to rebuild his relationship with Hope. No matter how much she wished things were simpler, the reality was that Hope had been his dog before she had been hers. And Sarah knew that, in some way, they all had to learn to share this healing journey. One evening, after a long day, Sarah sat on the couch, looking out the window, lost in thought. Hope was curled up next to her, her head resting on Sarah's lap. Sarah absent-mindedly stroked her fur, trying to make sense of everything. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Sarah stood up, startled, unsure who could be at the door at this time of night. She opened it to find David standing there, his face serious. He had been coming by more often, as agreed, but something about the way he looked tonight told her that something had changed. "Can we talk?" David asked softly. Sarah stepped aside to let him in. As he walked into the living room, Hope immediately perked up. She didn't run to the door as she had before, but she watched David from a distance, her tail giving a cautious wag. It was progress, but it wasn't the trust that Sarah had hoped for yet. David sat down across from Sarah, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've been thinking," he began. "I know this is difficult, and I know I've made mistakes. But I've come to realize something. I can't keep expecting Hope to forgive me overnight. I can't rush this process. I want to be part of her life, but I'm not going to force it." Sarah listened quietly, surprised by his admission. He had come to terms with the fact that Hope's forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't something anyone could demand, it had to be earned. David was acknowledging the truth of that, and in doing so, he had taken a crucial step. "I just wanted you to know," David continued, "that I'm not here to take her away. I'm not here to replace you in her life. I just want to be part of it, when she's ready. If she ever is." The sincerity in his voice touched Sarah in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, it was an acknowledgement of the journey ahead. He wasn't asking for everything at once. He was simply asking for a chance. I think you're right," Sarah said, her voice soft. "It's not about rushing things. It's about giving Hope the time she needs to decide what's best for her. And I want her to feel safe and loved. That's all that matters." David nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and hope. "I'll wait. I'll keep doing the work I need to do. And I'll be here when she's ready. I promise." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't an instant fix. But it was progress, real progress. They were all learning how to heal together, even if the road was long. The next few weeks were filled with small moments of healing. Hope would allow David to pet her for a few seconds longer each time he visited. She would sit beside him on the porch, her head resting on his knee as she had once done in the past, but she never stayed long. It was as though she was testing the waters, trying to determine if it was safe to trust him again. Sarah gave David space, but she also made sure to keep a close eye on everything. She wasn't going to let Hope be hurt again, not on her watch. But she was learning to trust David as he proved, day by day, that he was committed to the long journey of rebuilding trust, not just with Hope, but with her as well. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at work, Sarah came home to find something she hadn't expected. Hope was sitting on the porch, her tail wagging gently as David crouched beside her, talking to her in soothing tones. It was a simple moment, but it was a milestone. Hope had finally allowed David to get closer, to be a part of her life in a way she hadn't before. Sarah stood at the door for a moment, watching them. She had always known that this was going to take time, but seeing this quiet moment of connection filled her with hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could work out after all. Hope turned to Sarah, her eyes bright, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in her eyes that she hadn't seen before: acceptance. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was enough. Hope had decided, in her own time, that it was okay to trust again. As Sarah stepped outside to join them, she realized that the healing journey was far from over. But in that moment, with Hope by her side and David trying his best, she understood that sometimes the greatest healing comes from simply allowing time to do its work. The future was uncertain, but for now, Sarah knew that they were all moving in the right direction. Together. The weeks that followed were a slow but steady climb toward trust. Every day was a little better than the last. Hope's transformation was undeniable. The once fearful, broken dog who had been abandoned in the woods was now a confident, playful animal. She would run through the yard with Sarah, her ears flying back in excitement, her tail wagging vigorously. There were moments when she seemed to be a completely different dog, one who had learned that love and safety were not just temporary promises, but a way of life. But David still wasn't fully part of that world. Hope's healing had taken root, but her connection to him remained tentative. Every time he visited, she would approach with caution. There was a careful dance between them, a game of proximity and retreat, of getting a little closer but never fully letting her guard down. David knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. His past mistakes still loomed over him, and Hope's ability to forgive him couldn't be rushed. But what he didn't expect was that Sarah, too, was struggling with the complexity of the situation. She had grown attached to Hope in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the idea of someone else, especially the person who had hurt Hope, becoming a bigger part of her life brought up unexpected emotions. There were moments when Sarah would sit on the porch, watching Hope and David interact, and a knot would form in her stomach. She wasn't sure if she was feeling protective, jealous, or just unsure of what to do. For so long, it had been just her and Hope, and now she wasn't sure where David fit in. One afternoon, when Sarah returned home from work, she found David sitting in the yard with Hope, tossing a ball for her. Hope was clearly enjoying herself, jumping and chasing after the ball with the joy that Sarah had longed to see in her. And for the first time, Sarah noticed something different in David's demeanor. He wasn't just sitting there hoping to earn Hope's forgiveness. He was just being with her. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet connection forming between the two of them. As Sarah approached, David looked up at her, his expression calm, not seeking approval, but simply acknowledging her presence. "She's doing better," he said softly, his voice filled with an emotion that Sarah couldn't quite place. "She's starting to trust me again. And it feels right. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm not going to give up on her." Sarah felt a pang in her heart. It was hard to admit, but she knew that she had been holding back, unsure of how much room she should give David in Hope's life. The bond between her and Hope had been built on trust, on shared experiences, on rescuing each other. Now there was a third person in that equation, and Sarah wasn't sure how to navigate it. "I'm glad she's getting better," Sarah replied, her voice soft but guarded. She took a deep breath, pushing past the discomfort that had settled in her chest. "I want her to have everything she deserves. But I have to admit, I'm struggling with how this is all changing. I've gotten so used to just the two of us." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand. It's not easy for me, either. But I think we both know that this isn't just about me and her. It's about what's best for her. If that means taking it slow, then that's what we'll do." The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else there, too. A mutual respect for what they were trying to build, not just for Hope, but for each other. They weren't going to rush things. They were going to take it one step at a time, even if it meant waiting for Hope to make the first move, even if it meant questioning everything they thought they knew. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself letting go of the fear that had been holding her back. She began to see that Hope's healing wasn't just her responsibility. It was David's, too, in his own way. He wasn't asking for everything, he was simply trying to be a part of Hope's life in a way that allowed her to make the choice, to decide when she was ready to fully embrace him again. And in doing so, he was showing Sarah something important, that healing wasn't about ownership. It was about giving space, about allowing things to unfold as they were meant to. One evening, after a long day, Sarah found herself sitting on the porch with Hope, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with deep oranges and purples, and the cool breeze ruffled through the trees. Hope lay by her feet, her head resting on Sarah's lap, her eyes half closed in contentment. There was a sense of peace between them now, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. Hope had learned to trust again, and in doing so, she had shown Sarah that trust could be rebuilt, one small moment at a time. As Sarah stroked Hope's fur, she glanced over at David, who was sitting a few feet away, looking out at the horizon. His presence didn't feel like an intrusion anymore. It felt like part of the new normal they were creating, a reality that was slowly taking shape around them. "I think we're getting there," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "It's not perfect, but we're moving in the right direction." David turned to her, his eyes filled with understanding. "Yeah, it's a long road, but we'll get there. Together." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle over her. There were still so many unknowns, so many unanswered questions about the future. But one thing was clear, Hope was healing. David was trying. And Sarah was ready to accept that they all had a part to play in this journey. It wasn't about who came first or who had the most claim to hope, it was about moving forward, one step at a time, as a family. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah believed that maybe, just maybe, they would all be okay. Time continued to pass, and the quiet healing process between Sarah, Hope, and David slowly grew into something more solid. While it wasn't a perfect situation, it was clear that Hope was becoming more and more comfortable with David's presence. Every time he came by, she would sit a little closer, her initial hesitance now tempered with curiosity and trust. But Sarah knew that there was still so much more to this journey. Hope was still trying to piece together the pieces of her past, and David, despite his best efforts, was still uncertain if he would ever be fully accepted back into Hope's world. For Sarah, this meant navigating a delicate balance. She loved Hope more than anything, and she had become so protective of her over time. But she also understood the importance of allowing David to be part of the healing process. One evening, as Sarah and Hope sat together on the couch, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how much things had changed. The dog who had once cowered in fear, unsure of her surroundings, now sat beside Sarah, content and at ease. It was a beautiful transformation, but also a reminder of how fragile trust could be. She couldn't rush Hope's healing any more than she could rush her own. The doorbell rang, and Sarah stood up, expecting David. When she opened the door, he was standing there with a small smile on his face. He was holding a leash, but it wasn't just any leash, it was a new one. A special one. Sarah raised an eyebrow as she stepped aside to let him in. "I thought," David began, his voice a bit uncertain, "maybe we could go for a walk. You, me, and Hope. I know it's a big step, but I think we're ready. At least, I hope so." Sarah looked at him, a sense of caution in her heart. A walk seemed like such a simple thing, but for Hope, it felt like a test. A test of trust, of healing, of moving forward. Hope hadn't been outside for more than a few short walks with Sarah, and she'd never had both Sarah and David together with her during those moments. The idea of opening that door for both of them, letting them walk together as a family, was a big leap. Hope stood up, her tail wagging at the sound of David's voice. She seemed to sense the change in the air, her body tense with uncertainty but also curiosity. Sarah could tell that Hope was still unsure, but she was willing to try. And so was Sarah. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady. "Let's give it a try." David smiled, though there was still a hint of nervousness in his eyes. As he attached the leash to Hope's collar, Sarah watched closely. Would this be the moment Hope decided to fully accept him again, or would she pull back in fear? Would this simple walk turn into something more, or would it feel like a false start? They stepped outside into the cool evening air, and for the first time, the three of them walked together, Sarah leading, David walking behind her, Hope walking in between them. At first, Hope kept her distance, looking up at Sarah every few steps, as if checking in to make sure she was still there. Her steps were cautious, her body still tense, but she didn't retreat. She stayed close enough to feel the warmth of Sarah's presence and the familiarity of her steady rhythm. But as they walked, something shifted. Slowly, Hope's body language softened. She took a few more steps ahead, the leash slackening, her steps becoming more confident. David, noticing the change, moved a little closer to her, his hand reaching out carefully. And to Sarah's surprise, Hope didn't shy away. Instead, she allowed David to walk closer, her body language no longer screaming uncertain, but something more like willing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the instant acceptance that Sarah had hoped for, but it was progress. A big step forward in a journey that had been filled with doubts, fears, and moments of hesitation. By the time they reached the park, Hope was walking more freely. She was still aware of both Sarah and David, checking in with them every few moments, but there was a sense of ease in her steps. She wasn't being forced into something she wasn't ready for. She was participating in her own way, deciding that, for now, it was okay to be surrounded by both of them. They sat on the park bench together, Hope lying down at their feet. David looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a quiet hope. "She's doing better, isn't she?" he asked, his voice full of something deeper now, more certainty than before. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. "She is. And so are we." The three of them sat there for a while, simply enjoying the moment. Hope relaxed beside them, her eyes closed, trusting that the world around her was safe, for the first time in a long while. This wasn't the end of the road. Not by a long shot. There would be setbacks, moments when things didn't feel quite right, and times when Hope would need more space, more time. But for that evening, the simple act of walking together, of being together, felt like a victory. It was a small step, but it was one that mattered. The walk had been the moment that Sarah, David, and Hope had all been waiting for. It was a quiet declaration that they were willing to move forward, slowly but surely. There was no rush. No need for grand gestures. Just small moments of trust, of healing, of making room for one another. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected, a sense of peace. She was no longer afraid of what the future held. With Hope beside her, and David by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next, one step at a time. Together. As they made their way home, Hope walked with more confidence, her steps aligned with theirs. And in that shared rhythm, Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, knowing that while the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, they were on it together. A family, healing, growing, and moving forward. Months passed, and life slowly fell into a new routine. Sarah, Hope, and David had settled into a delicate balance. Hope had fully embraced her place in this new chapter, and her bond with both Sarah and David grew stronger each day. It was a relationship that had been built on patience, understanding, and, most of all, love. One crisp morning, Sarah found herself sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she watched Hope chase after a squirrel outside the window. The sight of the dog bounding across the yard with joy made her smile. It was such a simple thing, but for Sarah, it was a reminder of how far Hope had come. From the timid, terrified dog who had been abandoned, to the confident, playful companion who now ran with freedom. David had been coming around more regularly, and his relationship with Hope was continuing to evolve. Though Hope was still cautious at times, she had finally started to show him the trust he had worked so hard to earn. There were moments when she would curl up next to him on the couch, her head resting on his lap, and he would gently stroke her fur, his face softened by the quiet bond they had built. It wasn't the same as before, their connection was different, more cautious, but it was there, and it was real. As Sarah sat lost in thought, her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from David. He had a simple request: "Can we talk?" A feeling of unease settled in Sarah's stomach, but she quickly pushed it aside. Over time, David had proven his commitment to Hope and their family. He wasn't asking for anything grand or unrealistic, he just wanted to be there for them. So she picked up the phone and texted back, "Of course, come by when you can." An hour later, the doorbell rang, and Sarah rose to answer it. She opened the door to find David standing there, holding a small, unmarked envelope in his hands. His face was serious, but there was an unmistakable hint of hope in his eyes. "What's this?" Sarah asked, eyeing the envelope. David handed it to her, his hands slightly trembling. "I think it's time we take the next step. I want to make this official." Sarah's confusion deepened as she opened the envelope. Inside, she found a document. Her eyes scanned it quickly, and it took a moment for the full meaning to hit her. It was a legal adoption paper. David was asking to officially adopt Hope. "I know that we've come a long way, and I know we still have a lot to figure out," David began, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "But I want to make sure that Hope knows that I'm not going anywhere, that I'll be here for her, no matter what. I don't want her to ever feel like she's in limbo again. I want to give her the stability she deserves, and I want to make it official. Will you allow me to adopt her?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a request she had expected. She had never even considered the idea of David adopting Hope, not because she didn't think he could, but because it felt like a huge step, one that was filled with uncertainty. Hope had come to trust David, but adoption was a different kind of commitment. David seemed to sense her hesitation, and he quickly added, "I'm not asking for her to forget the past. I know that can never happen. But I want her to feel like she has a place with me, with us. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Sarah stood in silence, her mind racing. The weight of the decision was heavy. She looked at David, truly looked at him, and saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't asking for a fresh start, he was asking for a continuation of the journey they had already begun. He wasn't trying to replace her role in Hope's life, but instead was trying to become a permanent, supportive part of it. Hope trotted over and nudged Sarah's leg, sensing her uncertainty. Sarah looked down at the dog, her heart swelling with emotion. Hope had been through so much, and she had come so far. She had found a new family, one that was built on love, not blood. And now, David was offering to be a permanent part of that family, a part of Hope's life that had already started to take root. With a deep breath, Sarah looked back at David. The uncertainty still lingered, but in that moment, she realized that this was the next step they all needed to take. "Okay," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it. Let's make it official." A relieved smile spread across David's face, and Sarah could see the weight of the decision lift from his shoulders. He had made this choice for Hope, but also for himself. He had shown that he was willing to stand by them, no matter what, for as long as it took. They spent the rest of the afternoon filling out the paperwork together, and for the first time, Sarah felt a true sense of peace. Hope, who had been so uncertain for so long, was now a permanent part of their family. Not just because of a piece of paper, but because they had all committed to one another. They had built something that was not just about healing from the past, but about creating a future together. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the yard, Sarah, David, and Hope sat together in the grass, their hearts united in a bond that had taken time, effort, and a lot of love to build. The future was still unknown, but for the first time, Sarah felt like they were ready to face it together. And as Hope lay her head in Sarah's lap, her body completely relaxed for the first time in a long while, Sarah knew that no matter what came next, they had all found their way home. Together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and Sarah, David, and Hope sat together, the bond they had fought for was stronger than ever. They had weathered storms, faced uncertainty, and learned to trust again. Together, they had found peace and love in the most unexpected of places. And with that, they were ready to take on whatever the future would bring, together, as a family. If you've been touched by Hope's incredible journey and the healing power of love, share this story with your friends and family. There are so many animals out there who need our compassion and support. And just like Hope, they can find a second chance at happiness. For more heartwarming, emotional stories that will keep you inspired, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world, and together we can continue to spread love, kindness, and the amazing transformations that can happen when we never give up. Stay tuned for more incredible stories, and remember, every day is a chance to make a difference. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love.